In the farthest bend of Tennessee's forgotten backroads, where the trees grow too thick and the air never feels right, there once stood a house the locals swore could breathe. It was said that the shutters moved even when the wind stood still, and if you walked close enough, you could hear the faint sound of humming, a woman's voice, soft and cracked, rising from somewhere deep within the walls. That was the home of Jeremiah Haskins, a man of scripture and sin, who kept his family hidden from the world for reasons no one dared to ask. His daughter, Elsie, was the ghost no one ever saw but everyone feared. Born in isolation, she grew up under candlelight and prayer, her world confined to creaking floorboards and her father's sermons that spoke of purity of blood. The neighbors called it madness. But Jeremiah called it destiny. When Elsie turned 13, the sound of the chapel bell echoed through the valley for the first time in decades. No preacher came. No guests arrived. Only the faint murmur of vows spoken between a man and his child carried through the mist. By morning, the forest was still again, but from that day forward, no bird would land near the Haskins place, and no one who went looking for Elsie ever returned. Some say she still walks those woods, her wedding dress yellowed with time, her eyes searching for the mother who tried to save her. Others swear they've heard her calling for help through the hollow at night, her voice trembling with the weight of a curse that never died. But those who know the story, the real story, don't speak of it out loud. Not in Tennessee. Not after dark. There's a valley in Tennessee that doesn't appear on most maps, hidden beneath layers of fog and silence so thick even the birds seem to avoid it. Locals call it the hollow that hums, a place where wind never truly stops but never seems to move anything either. Generations of families have lived nearby, yet not one of them has dared to build a home within that shadowed basin since the Haskins tragedy more than a century ago. Even now, those who drive too close claim their radios lose signal, their engines sputter, and for just a moment, they can hear something faint, a woman's humming, steady and distant, coming from the trees. It's the same tune, they say, that used to drift down from Jeremiah Haskins' farmhouse long before the valley went quiet forever. Old folks who still remember whisper the tale in half-words and warnings. They'll say, "Don't take that road past sundown," or "Keep your lights off near the creek bend," because everyone knows strange things happen when you disturb the hollow after dark. There's talk of lanterns flickering between the trees, of laughter that fades into crying, of footsteps that follow travelers long after they've left the valley behind. No one agrees on how much of it is real, but no one doubts that something terrible happened there. The story has been passed down like an infection, softly spoken but never forgotten. It begins, they say, with Jeremiah himself, a man who arrived from nowhere in the late 1800s, dragging with him a wagon, a pale wife, and 2 children who never once stepped out into the daylight. He claimed to be guided by the hand of God, preaching purity, obedience, and isolation. He built his house at the deepest part of the valley, far from the nearest town, and from that day forward, no one ever saw his family again except through distant candlelight. The neighbors tried to visit at first, bringing food and kindness, but Jeremiah turned them away with scripture and a shotgun. Over time, the road to his house grew over with vines, and the Haskins name became something spoken only in whispers. But the strangest thing, the part that still chills those who speak of it, is how the valley itself seemed to change after the Haskins settled there. The air grew heavy. Animals stopped nesting in the trees. Even the sound of water from the creek began to warp into something melodic, like someone humming beneath the earth. It's said that on the coldest nights, that same tune returns, the song of the woman who once lived in that house, carried by a voice that was never meant to be heard again. Elsie Haskins was born in that same valley, beneath a roof that groaned with the weight of secrets and prayer. Her father, Jeremiah, said she was a gift from divine blood, though no one from the outside world ever saw her or even knew she existed until decades later when her name began to circulate through whispered stories and fearful recollections. Her childhood was confined entirely within the creaking bones of that farmhouse, its narrow corridors, boarded windows, and the lingering scent of wax from the endless candles that lit her world. Jeremiah forbade sunlight from touching her skin, insisting it carried impurities from the fallen world. He told her the woods beyond the house were cursed, that people out there were marked by sin, and that she was meant for something purer, something sacred. From her memories, new obedience was survival. Her father's voice was law, and her mother's silence was warning enough. The house had its own rules, She could not open the windows, she could not ask about the world beyond the trees, and she could not speak unless Jeremiah spoke first. Every evening, he gathered the family for his readings, a mixture of scripture, twisted folklore, and strange chants he claimed were ancient truths passed down through their lineage. He would say, "The blood in your veins, Elsie, is the holiest gift God ever gave a child," and though she didn't fully understand, the words always made her shiver. Her mother, pale and hollow-eyed, would sit beside her, knitting in silence or whispering prayers under her breath that didn't sound like the ones Jeremiah taught. There was a sadness about her that Elsie couldn't name but always felt. Sometimes, late at night, her mother would sneak into her room, brush her hair gently, and hum a tune so faint it sounded almost like the one people later claimed to hear echoing through the woods. In those moments, Elsie saw a different world in her mother's eyes, a place filled with sunlight, laughter, and open skies. But as quickly as it came, the look would vanish when Jeremiah's heavy steps creaked down the hallway. Elsie's world remained as small as the flickering light that filled her room. She would stare through the cracks in the boards covering her window, catching glimpses of blue light and shadows moving between trees, wondering what lived out there beyond her father's warnings. Sometimes she thought she saw faces in the fog, watching, waiting. And though she was told to fear them, a small part of her, buried deep beneath fear and faith, wished they would find her, if only to prove the world outside still existed. As Elsie grew older, curiosity began to gnaw at the quiet corners of her mind. The house she had once accepted as her entire world started to feel smaller, the air thicker, and her father's sermons more like chains than guidance. She was nearing 12 when she began to notice the contradictions in Jeremiah's words. He spoke of protecting her from evil, yet his hands trembled with anger whenever she asked questions. He called the outside world a pit of corruption, but she often caught him staring through the cracks in the boarded windows, his face tense and hungry for something he refused to name. Her mother's eyes told a different truth, a sadness that deepened each time Jeremiah spoke of purity, of chosen blood, of the destiny their family was bound to fulfill. Elsie started listening when she wasn't supposed to. She would press her ear against the door during her father's late-night prayers, hearing not scripture but whispers, fragmented words that sounded more like pleading than worship. Sometimes she heard her mother crying softly in the next room, followed by Jeremiah's low voice and the sharp echo of something breaking. He told her these were tests from God, that suffering was proof of devotion, but the more she saw, the less she believed. The house itself seemed to sense her doubts. The floors creaked louder when she moved, the candlelight flickered violently when she lingered near the doors, and the air turned cold whenever she dared to think of escape. One night, she found a photograph tucked between the pages of one of Jeremiah's worn Bibles, a faded image of her mother standing in sunlight, smiling beside a man who wasn't Jeremiah. The back of the photograph was marked with a name she didn't recognize and the year 1878, long before her father had built their home in the valley. That was the first time Elsie realized there was a life her mother had lived before the hollow, a life Jeremiah had buried under his twisted faith. The discovery lit something inside her, something fragile but defiant. She began to question not just her father's words, but the rules that bound her. Why was her mother forbidden to speak of her past? Why did Jeremiah call her the chosen one? And what did he mean when he said, "Blood remembers its beginning"? Each question pushed her closer to the edge of something dangerous, something her father seemed to sense. His eyes followed her more closely now, his sermons grew harsher, and the locks on her door clicked louder each night. Somewhere deep within her, Elsie knew that her questions had woken something in the house that could not be put back to sleep. It was a night when the rain came in steady whispers, seeping through the cracks of the roof and tracing thin, trembling lines down the walls. Elsie lay awake, staring at the shadows that swayed with each flicker of the candle on her dresser. Her father's voice had been louder than usual at supper, his hands shaking as he read from the worn Bible he claimed held their destiny. Her mother had barely eaten, her eyes distant, fixed on the floor as though she were listening to something only she could hear. When the house finally went quiet, Elsie felt her door creak open, and her mother slipped in like a ghost. She sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale and drawn, her lips trembling as though they were fighting a war against silence. "Elsie," she whispered, her voice breaking like brittle glass. "You must listen and never repeat this." There was something in her tone, urgency mixed with terror, that made the candle flame twitch. For the first time, her mother spoke of the world before the valley, of a small town beyond the mountains where people laughed without fear, where the sun touched her skin freely, where Jeremiah had once been a different man. But her words grew heavier, slower, and then she said something that made Elsie's breath stop. "He wasn't just my husband," her mother said, her voice barely more than a breath. "He was my father once too." The air in the room seemed to collapse in on itself. Elsie stared at her mother, unable to understand, the words twisting in her mind until they formed something too horrifying to grasp. Her mother reached for her hand, clutching it tightly, her eyes wet with years of silence. She told her that Jeremiah believed their blood was sacred, chosen, untainted by the outside world, and that the only way to preserve it was to keep it within the same line. "He thinks he's saving us," her mother said, "but he's damned us instead." Before Elsie could speak, a floorboard creaked outside the door. Her mother froze, her grip tightening until it hurt. The candle flickered violently, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. In the black silence that followed, Elsie heard the slow, deliberate sound of her father's boots in the hall. Her mother pressed a trembling hand to her lips, her eyes wide and glistening, then slipped out the door without another word. The next morning, her bed was empty, her belongings gone, and her father told Elsie that the Lord had taken her home. He forbade her to ask questions, but Elsie knew better. She had seen the terror in her mother's eyes, and she understood now that the greatest danger in the valley was not outside their home, it was sitting at the head of the table. The days after her mother's disappearance were wrapped in an eerie quiet that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself had agreed to keep a secret. Jeremiah walked through the halls with renewed conviction, his eyes wild and bright, muttering to himself about destiny and divine order. Elsie was forbidden to speak of her mother again, forbidden to even enter the room where she had last seen her. The door was nailed shut, the faint smell of her mother's lavender soap still lingering behind the wood. Every night, Jeremiah led Elsie in prayer, his hands gripping hers too tightly, his voice trembling with something that no longer sounded holy. The candles burned longer, the Bible stayed open wider, and his sermons began to blur the line between faith and madness. On the evening of Elsie's 13th birthday, Jeremiah woke her before dawn. The valley was drenched in fog, and the only sound was the steady toll of the old chapel bell, something no one had heard in decades. He told her that God had spoken to him, that the time had come for her to fulfill her purpose. Elsie's heart pounded as she dressed in the white gown he had laid out on her bed, a gown that smelled faintly of dust and something older, something wrong. When she asked where they were going, he only smiled and said, "To meet the will of heaven." They walked through the woods, the trees pressing close as if trying to listen. The air was cold, heavy with mist, and somewhere far behind them, a coyote cried out before being swallowed by silence. When they reached the clearing, Elsie saw the chapel, its roof sagging, its door hanging crooked, its windows dark with mildew. Inside, candles lined the pews, their flames flickering like 100 small hearts. The light made the walls seem to breathe. At the front, a crude wooden cross leaned sideways, carved with strange markings that did not look like scripture. Jeremiah led her down the aisle, his hand trembling on her back. His voice broke as he began to speak words she did not recognize, half prayer, half chant. He spoke of bloodlines, of sacrifice, of purity made eternal. When he took her hand and placed a ring upon her finger, Elsie felt something inside her die, a quiet realization that there would be no salvation, no freedom, no light. The air grew thick with the smell of candle wax and sweat, and when Jeremiah lifted his head to look at her, she saw in his eyes not love, but devotion twisted into something monstrous. The sound of the bell echoed once more through the valley, hollow and endless, marking the moment the girl ceased to be a daughter and became something else entirely. The chapel that stood deep within the valley had long been forgotten by the townspeople, swallowed by vines and silence, a relic of faith left to rot. Its walls leaned inward as though crushed under the weight of every sin that had ever been whispered there. For years, locals had said no one should go near it, that strange lights glowed through the broken stained glass on moonless nights, and that the smell of smoke sometimes drifted from its rafters even though no fire burned. It was in that place, under the choking air of decay and mildew, that Jeremiah Haskins chose to seal his twisted ceremony. When he led Elsie inside, her bare feet scraping against the warped wooden floor, the air felt alive, breathing, pulsing with the low hum of the candles he had already lit. The light bent around the walls in strange ways, revealing fragments of symbols carved into the wood, crosses turned upside down, circles of ash, and handprints smeared in something too dark to be wax. Jeremiah called it a church of rebirth, a sacred ground untainted by the outside world. But nothing about it felt holy. The pews were empty, except for a few old dolls arranged like a congregation, their glass eyes cracked and clouded. The pulpit was draped with a torn wedding veil that looked as if it had been used many times before. At the altar, he had placed two objects side by side, a Bible missing its cover and a rusted knife. The mixture of scripture and blasphemy was terrifying in its precision, as though Jeremiah had spent years perfecting his ritual. Else's hands shook as he began to chant, his voice rising and falling like the moan of wind through hollow bones. The words were a blend of prayer and curse, promising eternal unity between blood and spirit. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills, and the ground trembled beneath the chapel floor. The candles flickered violently, their flames bending as if drawn toward Jeremiah himself. When he took her hand and pressed the knife against his palm, slicing it open, she wanted to run, but her legs refused to move. He smeared his blood across her forehead and whispered that they were now bound forever in the eyes of the Lord. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of voices rose from the woods, perhaps the townsfolk who had heard the bell and gathered to listen. They didn't enter, though, no one ever did. From outside, all they could hear was the sound of chanting that turned into laughter, then into screaming, then into nothing. When the storm passed, the chapel's candles were still burning, but the door was shut tight, and the air smelled of iron and roses. That night, the storm clawed through the valley as though trying to tear something loose from the earth itself. Rain beat against the trees in furious waves, lightning split the sky in jagged flashes, and the air seemed alive with the sound of something crying out from deep within the woods. The chapel's bell had stopped tolling hours before, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the thunder. Around midnight, a hunter named Samuel Price was making his way home from the ridge, his lantern struggling against the wind. He had taken the long route to avoid the hollow, but as the storm worsened, he found himself on the edge of the overgrown path that led straight to the Haskins' land. His horse refused to go further, snorting and backing away, ears pinned flat against its head. Samuel dismounted, cursing the weather, but then he saw it, a flicker of light moving between the trees, slow and pale, like a ghostly flame carried by invisible hands. He thought it was lightning at first, until he realized the light was moving uphill, away from the chapel ruins. As he stepped closer, he caught sight of a figure, small, barefoot, dressed in white. The gown was soaked through, clinging to her frail frame, the hem dragging behind her in the mud. Her hair hung wild and matted, and in the dim glow of his lantern, Samuel saw her face streaked with something dark, smeared across her cheek and neck. She moved as if she didn't see him, stumbling through the fog, her lips trembling as though she were whispering words he couldn't hear. "Miss," he called out, but the sound of his own voice felt wrong in that place. The girl stopped for a moment, turning her head slowly toward him. Her eyes caught the lantern light, wide and glassy, reflecting something that made his blood run cold. There was no fear in her expression, only emptiness, a kind of hollow calm that didn't belong to a living soul. Then she turned and vanished into the trees. Samuel searched for her until dawn, shouting her name though he didn't know it. He found footprints in the mud, small and bare, leading toward the creek, but they stopped halfway, as if the girl had simply disappeared. The only thing left was a torn piece of white fabric caught on a low branch, fluttering weakly in the morning breeze. When he returned to town the next day, he swore he'd seen a spirit, not a child, but when the sheriff led a search party to the spot, the chapel door was found wide open, and inside, the pews were drenched in blood that was still warm. When the search party reached the Haskins farmhouse, the sun had already begun to sink behind the ridge, leaving the valley bathed in a sickly orange light. The house stood silent, its windows dark, its porch covered in leaves and dirt as though it had been abandoned for years. Yet the ground was fresh with footprints, leading from the woods to the front door. The sheriff called out, but no answer came, only the slow groan of wood as the wind moved through the boards. When they pushed the door open, the hinges screamed like a living thing, and a wave of rot and candle smoke rolled out. Inside, the house looked frozen in time. Dishes sat half-eaten on the table, a Bible lay open beside a lantern, and the smell of iron filled the air, sharp and wrong. The men moved cautiously through the rooms, their boots creaking against the warped floorboards. In the hallway, they found deep scratches carved into the walls, marks that looked more like fingernails than tools. Upstairs, every mirror had been covered with cloth, and every window nailed shut. In one of the bedrooms, a small wooden cradle stood beside the bed, though no child had lived in that house for years. What unsettled them most, however, was the sense that someone was still there. The air carried warmth, and the faint sound of humming drifted down from the attic above, so faint it might have been imagined. The sheriff climbed the ladder slowly, lantern in hand. The attic was low and cramped, filled with old trunks, boxes of linens, and the lingering scent of something recently burned. At the far end, beneath a small window that had been painted black, stood Jeremiah's chair, tall, carved, and splattered with dark stains that had soaked deep into the wood. On the floor before it lay the remnants of a white dress, shredded and stiff with dried blood. But there was no sign of Jeremiah, and no sign of Elsie. It was as if the two had vanished into the very walls. The sheriff ordered the men to board the doors shut, saying the place should be left to its ghosts. As they hammered the last plank across the entrance, one of the younger deputies swore he heard a voice whisper his name from inside. The others laughed nervously, but none of them turned back to look. By morning, smoke was seen rising from the valley, thick and black, curling above the trees like the breath of something newly awakened. When the townspeople returned, the house was nothing but ash, the boards collapsed inward, and the air heavy with the smell of rain and burnt earth. No one knew who set the fire, but from that day on, no one ever built another home in the hollow. Even decades after the Haskins farmhouse had been reduced to ash, the valley remained a place of whispered warnings and uneasy silence. The locals who lived on the edges of the hollow told their children never to speak of it aloud, and anyone foolish enough to venture too close after dark risked more than just ridicule. They risked a presence that had long refused to rest. The trees grew twisted and dense, their roots gnarled like the fingers of something clawing its way up from the soil, and the creek that ran through the valley sang a different song now, a hollow echo that carried faint cries through the night. Parents would warn, if you hear her calling, do not answer, and for God's sake, do not say her name 3 times, though none of them could explain precisely what would happen if you did. The story of Elsie and the Haskins curse became a ritual of fear, passed down from one generation to the next. Children whispered of a girl in white wandering the woods, barefoot, her hair hanging matted and wet from the fog that rolled off the hills. They said she carried the scent of candle smoke and iron, that her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and that she called for her mother with a voice both soft and unbearable. Teenagers dared each other to approach the hollow, to see the shadow behind the trees or to glimpse the flickering light that appeared just before midnight. Some swore they saw her running between the trunks, her dress trailing behind her, her bare feet leaving prints that vanished before morning. The valley seemed to respond to every intrusion. Animals avoided it entirely, dogs would howl and refuse to enter, and birds never nested in the trees along its edges. On windless nights, the rustling of leaves sounded like footsteps pacing through the underbrush, and the faint hum that had been heard during Elsie's life returned as if the woods themselves remembered her presence. Those who stayed too long spoke of a cold that sank deep into their bones, of whispers brushing against their ears, and of a feeling that unseen eyes were following them wherever they went. Stories began to accumulate over the years. One farmer claimed to have seen a figure standing in the creek, staring silently with eyes that seemed almost human but far too hollow. Another woman swore that late one night, a hand reached for her from under the roots of a fallen tree, pulling her just long enough to leave claw marks on her arms. And every tale ended the same way, the warning to respect the valley, to speak no names aloud, and to never, under any circumstances, call Elsie 3 times, because if you did, she would answer, and no one could say what would come next. The memory of the Haskins curse endured, living in whispers, in the mist, and in the very soil of the valley itself. In 1986, a team of state surveyors arrived at the valley to chart the land for a proposed road expansion, but what they found instead was a mystery that had lain buried for nearly a century. The hollow, still thick with twisted trees and creeping fog, had long been left alone, considered too cursed and unstable to disturb. The surveyors noted the sunken foundation of what must have been the Haskins farmhouse, partially hidden beneath layers of moss and tangled roots. At first, it looked like little more than decayed wood and soil, but as they cleared debris, the outline of a cellar became visible. The earth around it was soft, as if something heavy had been pressed into it and left behind. A faint metallic smell clung to the air, subtle at first, then stronger as they dug deeper into the hollowed foundation. Inside the cellar, they found remnants that defied reason and comprehension. A wedding dress, yellowed with age, hung from a beam, the fabric stiff with time and moisture. It swayed slightly as if a ghostly hand had brushed against it, though the room was still. Bones lay intertwined beneath the dress, small and fragile, clutching a rusted ring whose details were nearly erased by corrosion. Some of the bones were arranged in unnatural positions, as though someone or something had tried to preserve them in a final, grotesque embrace. The surveyors, men accustomed to handling the unexpected, found themselves shivering despite the warm summer air. The smell of iron was pungent and unyielding, and the faint sound of movement seemed to come from the corners of the cellar, though the wind outside was still. One of the men swore he heard a whisper, a child's voice calling from beneath the floorboards, soft yet desperate. Others claimed they saw faint imprints of feet leading to the cellar stairs, though no one had entered or left since the foundation had collapsed decades before. The surveyors recorded the scene, their hands trembling as they catalogued the remnants, but none of the cameras captured the shadows that seemed to shift in the corners or the subtle pressure that seemed to push against them from beneath the floor. By the time the team left the valley, a heavy silence had settled over the hollow, as though the land itself exhaled and sank deeper into its own grief. The story of Elsie Haskins, of Jeremiah, of the house that consumed its own family, was no longer just folklore whispered by fearful townspeople. Evidence had been unearthed, stark and undeniable, that the valley had once been the site of something unthinkable. The wedding dress, the bones, the ring, they remained a testament to a horror long buried, yet impossibly present, a reminder that some stories refuse to die, and that some curses endure, resting quietly until someone disturbs the earth and awakens them once more.